By early April 1945, the Eastern Front had disintegrated into chaos. After the success of the Vistula-Oder offensive in January, Soviet armies advanced hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. Berlin itself lay exposed. German military command structures were shattered. Communications failed, supply lines collapsed. Units that once received daily orders now operated on rumors and fear. The German army had been drained by years of attrition, and what remained were exhausted formations filled with teenage conscripts and aging veterans. Intelligence reports from the front made the situation unmistakable. The Red Army was unstoppable, and resistance only delayed the inevitable. For many German soldiers, the question was no longer how to defend the Reich, but how to avoid the fate that awaited them in Soviet captivity. Accounts from refugees fleeing eastward brought grim confirmation. Civilians spoke of mass arrests, reprisals, and forced marches. German officers heard reports through military channels describing the treatment of prisoners captured by Soviet forces. Whether exaggerated or accurate, these stories spread rapidly and shaped decisions across the collapsing front. The fear of Soviet retribution was rooted in years of brutal warfare. The Eastern Front had been a war of annihilation from the beginning. German forces had committed atrocities across the Soviet Union, and many soldiers believed they would now face revenge. This belief hardened into certainty as Soviet artillery drew closer. For those still wearing German uniforms, surrendering to the Red Army seemed less like an end to the war and more like a death sentence. As April progressed, entire units began abandoning their positions without orders. Defensive lines existed only on maps. In reality, the front dissolved into streams of men moving west. German officers who once enforced discipline now quietly allowed withdrawals. Some even encouraged it. There was no longer any illusion of holding ground. Villages and forests filled with columns of soldiers moving away from the advancing Soviet forces. Equipment was discarded along roadsides. Tanks ran out of fuel and were destroyed by their own crews. The once rigid structure of the German army fractured under the weight of reality. This was not desertion in the traditional sense. It was a collective recognition that survival required escape. Refugee flows mirrored the military collapse. German civilians fled alongside soldiers, carrying what little they could salvage. Women, children, and the elderly joined the westward movement, driven by the same fear. The roads became clogged with carts, livestock, and foot traffic stretching for miles. American air reconnaissance later recorded these massive movements, noting the scale of displacement unlike anything seen before. This human tide was fueled by the belief that reaching Western Allied lines offered a chance at humane treatment. The United States Army had a reputation among German soldiers for adherence to the Geneva Convention. This perception mattered more than loyalty to a collapsing regime. By mid-April 1945, the final illusion of German coordination vanished. Hitler remained in Berlin, issuing orders that could not be carried out. Army Group Vistula and Army Group Center were reduced to fragments. Soviet forces crossed the Oder River and encircled Berlin. In the east, resistance collapsed town by town. In this environment, survival became an individual decision repeated millions of times. Soldiers weighed their options quietly and quickly. Fight and die in place, surrender to the Red Army, or attempt the dangerous journey west. The last option carried risks. Allied bombing, destroyed bridges, and the possibility of being cut off loomed large. But compared to the alternative, it was worth the gamble. This moment marked the true end of Nazi Germany as a functioning military power. The collapse of the Eastern Front did not end the war immediately, but it transformed its nature. The battlefield became a corridor of escape. German soldiers were no longer defenders of territory, but participants in a desperate migration. The Eastern Front was no longer about strategy or ideology, it was about avoiding annihilation. The breaking point had been reached, and the consequences would soon overwhelm the Western Allies as tens of thousands began moving toward American lines. The last race west had begun. driven by fear, calculation, and the raw instinct to survive. German commanders at every level received fragmented intelligence, but the message was consistent. Prisoners taken by the Western Allies were generally treated according to the Geneva Convention. Those captured by the Soviets often disappeared into a vast system of forced labor camps. This knowledge was not speculation. German officers had seen comrades vanish during earlier Soviet offensives. Reports circulated through Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS channels describing starvation, disease, and years of captivity in the Soviet Union. Whether fully accurate or magnified by fear, these reports shaped decisions on a massive scale. By April 1945, surrendering westward was no longer considered cowardice, it was considered rational. The geography of Germany itself became a map of survival. Rivers such as the Elbe and the Mule took on symbolic meaning. Crossing them meant reaching American-controlled territory. Failing to do so often meant encountering advancing Soviet units. Bridges destroyed by retreating German forces now became obstacles for those fleeing east to west. Improvised crossings were attempted under artillery fire and air attack. Entire units risked annihilation simply to reach the far bank. These waterways were no longer tactical features on a battlefield. They were boundaries between two very different futures. The United States Army had already halted its advance along agreed lines established during Allied conferences. American commanders knew that Berlin would fall to the Soviets. Yet German units continued to move toward them anyway. This created a strange dynamic. Armed formations approached American lines not to fight but to surrender. Some arrived in formation, with officers still in command and weapons stacked neatly. Others arrived exhausted and scattered, carrying white cloths or improvised flags. American soldiers, many of whom had prepared for fierce resistance, instead encountered mass capitulation. This was one of the most remarkable shifts in modern military history. German high command could no longer control these movements. Field Marshal Ferdinand Schorner attempted to enforce discipline through draconian measures, including summary executions for retreat. But such orders were largely ignored. The authority of the Nazi regime had evaporated. Loyalty to survival replaced loyalty to ideology. Even units that had fought fanatically earlier in the war now sought American captivity. This included elements of the Waffen-SS, once considered the most ideologically committed force in Germany. By April 1945, ideology could not outweigh fear of Soviet imprisonment. The American forces themselves were caught between policy and reality. Officially, surrendering German troops east of the Elbe were to be turned over to Soviet authorities. In practice, American commanders often faced tens of thousands of surrendering soldiers with no clear instructions. Turning them back meant sending them toward likely death. Some commanders delayed transfers, citing logistical difficulties. Others processed prisoners rapidly, overwhelmed by numbers far beyond expectations. This period tested Allied agreements and individual conscience alike. The strategic choice between East and West was not limited to soldiers. Civilians made the same calculation. Entire towns emptied as residents fled advancing Soviet forces, hoping to reach American zones. Mothers pushed carts through ruined roads. Children walked for days. Elderly men leaned on sticks, driven by fear rather than orders. American military police and frontline units recorded scenes of desperation unprecedented even in a war defined by suffering. These civilians believed that American captivity, or even occupation, offered a chance at survival and dignity. By the final days of April, this calculated movement became a flood. The collapse of the Eastern Front had created a vacuum that pulled everything westward. German soldiers understood that the war was lost, but how it ended mattered deeply. Captivity was inevitable. The question was under whose control. Rivers, roads, and ruined cities became the final obstacles in this race. Every mile gained westward increased the odds of survival. Every delay risked capture by Soviet forces closing in from behind. This strategic choice reshaped the final battles of World War II in Europe. Fighting continued, but its purpose had changed. It was no longer about defending the Reich, it was about reaching the Americans. The last race west was underway in earnest, and its human cost and historical significance would soon overwhelm even the most experienced Allied planners. By early May 1945, the German forces had all but disappeared from the battlefield, but the consequences of their sudden collapse would have lasting effects on both the Allies and the millions of soldiers and civilians now scrambling to escape the advancing Red Army. The American forces, already overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the movement toward their lines, were now managing one of the most unexpected and chaotic logistical challenges of the entire war. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, auxiliaries, and civilians, men, women, and children had flooded into Allied-controlled areas. Far from being defeated mobs, many of these were organized units still capable of fighting but making a deliberate choice to surrender. This was no chaotic flight. It was a calculated movement to ensure survival, and it would overwhelm the Western Allies' plans for the post-war occupation of Germany. The logistical challenges were immense. From the moment the first German soldiers crossed the American lines in April 1945, Allied commanders began to realize that the numbers of prisoners would exceed anything they had anticipated. German soldiers had become aware that the American treatment of prisoners was relatively humane compared to the brutalities of Soviet captivity. The Geneva Convention had established protections for prisoners of war, but these laws had been largely ignored in the Soviet sphere. This fear of Soviet retaliation, coupled with the growing realization that the American army was a more appealing alternative, created the flood of German troops heading west. By the time the Red Army was only a few hundred kilometers from Berlin, the American forces found themselves under a strain they had not foreseen. Despite the general expectation that the war was coming to a close, the sheer scale of the surrender was unprecedented. The scale of this mass movement toward the Western Allies reshaped the final weeks of the war and had profound effects on how the Allies would deal with the occupying forces in post-war Europe. In towns and villages near the Elbe River, American soldiers began encountering German units that had not been defeated in combat but had instead willingly surrendered. Many of these soldiers were in reasonably good physical condition and still wore the iconic gray-green uniforms of the Wehrmacht, Waffen-SS, or Luftwaffe. Some even continued to wear their helmets and carried weapons, though most had emptied their rifles of ammunition. These were not defeated men begging for mercy. These were soldiers who had made a cold calculation about their survival prospects. Rather than face the terrifying prospect of Soviet captivity or the wrath of the Red Army, they had chosen surrender to the Americans. American soldiers, however, were not prepared for the sheer volume of people crossing into their lines. The initial trickle became a flood as German formations, numbering in the tens of thousands, continued to surrender. In some cases, entire divisions voluntarily laid down their arms. The logistics of processing so many prisoners were staggering. Thousands of men were crammed into makeshift holding pens, often in open fields, waiting to be transported to prisoner-of-war camps or, in many cases, directly to the rear. But what truly overwhelmed the American forces were the civilians. Women, children, and elderly Germans, who had also fled the Soviet advance, added to the confusion and strain on the American lines. The United States Army, stretched thin by the demands of war, found itself struggling to provide for the growing numbers of prisoners and refugees. Food and water, already in short supply after months of heavy fighting, became even scarcer as the scale of the surrender grew. A large portion of the Allied logistical resources that had been intended for the final push toward Berlin had to be diverted to deal with the unanticipated mass surrender. The Americans had made provisions for prisoners of war, but the sheer numbers were overwhelming. There were no pre-established plans for such a massive influx of soldiers, civilians, and displaced persons. In some areas, American soldiers found themselves organizing makeshift camps to hold the prisoners until more permanent solutions could be found. Field hospitals, medical units, and food distribution points were set up hastily to deal with the health and welfare of the incoming masses. It was not uncommon to see a group of prisoners surrounded by exhausted American guards, all struggling to maintain control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's expectations. Yet, despite the immense strain on their resources, the Americans were determined to adhere to the standards set forth by the Geneva Convention, ensuring that captured German soldiers were treated humanely. American officers, who were primarily focused on maintaining order, had to balance the immediate need for logistical organization with their commitment to the principles of wartime conduct. For many Germans, it became clear that they had made the right choice in choosing to surrender to the Americans rather than face the grim reality of Soviet imprisonment. For the German soldiers, the question of whether to surrender was not an easy one. Many had fought for years in some of the most brutal campaigns in modern warfare. The horrors of war were etched into their minds, and the devastation they had witnessed left few illusions about the consequences of defeat. But as the war came to its final stages, the realization that Germany was no longer capable of victory made this question even more pressing. In the final days of April and early May, as the Soviet army stormed across the Eastern Front and the American forces pressed in from the west, German soldiers understood that their survival depended on getting to the right side of the front lines. This moment of surrender was not simply a military event, it was a human one. Soldiers who had fought alongside each other for years, who had survived horrific battles and endured unimaginable hardships, now had to make the ultimate decision: continue fighting and face certain death, or surrender and hope for the mercy of the enemy. As the Soviet forces neared, surrendering to the Americans was seen as the only way out. Civilians, many of whom had already lived through the horrors of the war, understood this as well. Those fleeing eastward were not simply trying to escape soldiers, but were trying to escape the fate that awaited them in the hands of the Soviets. By early May, the last race west was over. The strategic movements of German soldiers, civilians, and displaced persons had reached their culmination. The number of prisoners held by the American forces continued to grow, and with it, the burden on the logistical systems of the Allied forces. But for many, this was not the end of their war. It was simply the beginning of a new chapter. For the Germans, captivity was their new reality, but they had at least escaped the horrors of Soviet retribution. By May 8, 1945, the war in Europe had officially come to an end, with Nazi Germany surrendering unconditionally to the Allied forces. But the end of combat did not mark the end of the struggle for many German soldiers, civilians, and their captors. Instead, the sheer scale of the surrender posed an entirely new set of challenges. American forces, already stretched thin from months of intense fighting, now had to contend with the overwhelming logistical task of managing the largest mass surrender in modern military history. Tens of thousands of German prisoners, most of whom had crossed into Allied-held territory not because they were defeated on the battlefield, but because they had made a strategic choice for survival, were now in the hands of the Western Allies. And as the war ended, the question shifted from how to continue fighting to how to manage the aftermath of a war that had already left millions displaced. The flood of prisoners and refugees that had swelled Allied lines in the final weeks of the war required immediate attention. American forces had to establish and manage prisoner-of-war camps, medical treatment facilities, and systems for food distribution. The challenge was further compounded by the fact that many of these German prisoners were not the defeated remnants of a shattered army, but intact, organized formations that had willingly surrendered. These were soldiers who, until mere days ago, had been capable of holding territory and continuing the fight. They were not broken men, but disciplined military personnel with chains of command, making them more difficult to manage than typical prisoners of war. Among these surrendered forces were soldiers who had fought in the very campaigns that had decimated Europe. Some had served on the front lines of the Eastern Front, others had been involved in the invasion of France, and still others had been part of the defense against the Allied assault on Germany's western borders. Despite the overwhelming sense of defeat that permeated their ranks, many German soldiers still held on to the remnants of military discipline. They did not simply throw down their weapons and surrender in a panicked flight. They arrived in organized groups, still adhering to military procedures and expecting to be treated according to the laws of war. As the number of prisoners increased by the day, the strain on American logistical systems grew. The Geneva Convention, which the Americans had promised to uphold, mandated humane treatment for prisoners of war, but there were practical challenges in meeting those obligations. Field hospitals, which had already been tasked with treating wounded soldiers, were overwhelmed with an influx of prisoners suffering from a variety of ailments, including exhaustion, malnutrition, and the effects of long-term combat. Some prisoners had not eaten properly for weeks, others were suffering from exposure to the elements, and many had injuries that had been untreated for far too long. The burden on medical personnel became almost unbearable as they struggled to treat the growing numbers of German prisoners while still maintaining care for their own troops. At the same time, the American military found itself dealing with a massive humanitarian crisis. In addition to the captured soldiers, civilians who had fled from the advancing Red Army now filled the ranks of the refugees. Women, children, and the elderly filled makeshift camps, unsure of where to go or what to do. For many of them, the decision to flee had been made long before the end of the war. They, too, had heard the stories of Soviet brutality, and they had made the choice to risk everything in order to find safety in the West. The humanitarian crisis was compounded by the Allies' own priorities for the post-war order. The Potsdam Agreement, signed in July 1945, would divide Germany into occupation zones controlled by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. The American zone, which included much of Western Germany, became a haven for thousands of refugees. But it also became a land of uncertainty. The collapse of the Nazi regime had left a power vacuum, and the incoming Allied occupation forces were tasked with restoring order in a country that had been decimated by years of war and totalitarian rule. The displaced German civilians, many of whom had already lost everything in the chaos of the war, now found themselves subject to Allied regulations. As the weeks turned into months, the challenges of managing the post-war environment only grew. The German soldiers and civilians who had surrendered were not simply prisoners. They were part of a vast population now caught in a political and social transition. The Americans, who had once been seen as liberators in the eyes of the Western European nations, were now tasked with managing a population that had once been their enemy. The prisoners of war who had sought refuge in the American zone now found themselves subject to internment and forced labor. Many were sent to work in agricultural or industrial projects to help rebuild the country. The number of German prisoners in American hands was staggering, and the prospect of reintegrating them into German society was complicated by the deep ideological divides that still permeated European politics. For the Americans, these logistical and humanitarian challenges were compounded by the knowledge that they had to prepare for the next stage of the post-war world. With the Soviet Union now controlling much of Eastern Germany and most of Central and Eastern Europe, the Western Allies had to face the reality of the growing Cold War. The presence of Soviet forces in the East, along with their brutal treatment of German prisoners, further complicated the post-war reconstruction efforts. For the millions of German soldiers and civilians who had chosen to surrender to the Americans, the war may have ended, but their struggle was far from over. By the summer of 1945, the American military had processed hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, civilians, and displaced persons. The immense scale of the surrender in the final days of the war, combined with the need for careful post-war planning, would come to define the American occupation of Germany. The survivors of the last race west were now part of a much larger story: the reconstruction of Europe and the beginning of a new global order. With the conclusion of World War II in Europe, the survivors of the final race west had arrived at a new, uncertain chapter in their lives. While the war was over, the impact of their choices would reverberate for years to come. The millions of people who chose to cross into American-controlled territories in the final days of the war had changed the course of history not just for Germany, but for the entire world.